The morning of February 20th, 1943 broke hot and humid over Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Jimmy Collins gripped the stick of his P-40 Warhawk as he lined up behind a Japanese Oscar fighter, the two aircraft closing fast through the tropical sky. 200 yards separated them, close enough for a confident shot, yet far enough that everything had to be perfect. Collins centered the glowing orange dot from his reflector sight squarely on the enemy's fuselage and squeezed the trigger. His 650 caliber machine guns erupted in violent synchronization, sending nearly 100 rounds toward the Japanese fighter in just 2 seconds. Tracers streaked through the air in bright lines. Then nothing. The bullets passed harmlessly behind the Oscar's tail, missing by 30 or 40 feet. The Japanese pilot sensed the danger instantly, banking hard left and diving into the cloud layer below. Within seconds, the enemy was gone. Collins stared at his gun sight in disbelief. He had centered the aiming dot perfectly. His guns were bore-sighted correctly. He'd tested them on the ground just days before. The range had been ideal, his aircraft stable, his aim true, yet somehow he had missed completely. The problem wasn't unique to Collins. In that brutal half-second while his bullets crossed the distance between the two aircraft, the Oscar had drifted nearly 180 feet sideways. At 250 miles per hour, the Japanese fighter simply wasn't where it had been when Collins pulled the trigger. His bullets were racing toward a ghost, toward where the target had been, not where it was heading. The mathematics were pitiless and unforgiving. 50 caliber rounds traveled at 280 feet per second, blistering fast by infantry standards, yet somehow not instantaneous enough when chasing a maneuvering enemy across the sky. Across the Pacific, the same story repeated itself countless times. American pilots were returning from missions having fired every round in their magazines and hitting nothing but air. Gun camera footage told the story plainly. American fighters closing on Japanese aircraft and missing by incredible margins, their tracers passing through empty sky where targets had been mere moments before. The statistics were crushing. By early 1943, fewer than 5% of American fighter pilots had scored even a single confirmed kill. The handful of natural marksmen, Dick Bong, Bob Johnson, Tommy Maguire, were responsible for 95% of all aerial victories. These men possessed an intuitive understanding of deflection shooting that simply couldn't be taught through conventional training methods. Collins hadn't known he was wrestling with a physics problem at 200 miles per hour. He thought he was flying and shooting, doing what he'd been trained to do. What the 23-year-old farm boy from Iowa didn't understand was that American pilots everywhere were bumping up against the same invisible wall. Superior aircraft meant nothing if pilots couldn't hit their targets. Better training seemed futile when the human brain simply couldn't calculate three-dimensional deflection angles while pulling multiple Gs and keeping an eye on enemy positions. But across the ocean, in secret workshops, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, British engineers were working on something revolutionary. They had identified the problem and were perfecting a solution, a device that would think for pilots, a mechanical brain that could calculate dozens of equations every second. Instead of aiming at enemy aircraft, pilots would soon aim at empty sky, at ghosts that didn't yet exist. The machine would do the mathematics, and those ghosts would become devastatingly real. Dr. Leslie Cunningham stood in his laboratory at Farnborough, staring at the spinning gyroscope on his bench. The device, no larger than a coffee cup, rotated at 18,000 revolutions per minute, its polished metal surface gleaming under the harsh laboratory lights. When Cunningham attempted to tilt the gyroscope's mounting bracket, the spinning wheel resisted with surprising force, fighting stubbornly to maintain its original orientation. The principle was called gyroscopic precession. A spinning mass always tries to stay aligned with its original axis, no matter how violently the world around it moves. It was March 1941, and the Battle of Britain had already revealed something profoundly troubling about aerial combat. RAF pilots, despite their courage and the superiority of their Hurricanes and Spitfires, were missing their targets with appalling regularity. Gun camera footage showed British fighters pouring fire at German bombers and hitting nothing but empty air. The problem wasn't pilot courage or aircraft capability. It was the fundamental impossibility of calculating deflection angles while flying at 300 miles per hour. Cunningham had spent months wrestling with the mathematics of the problem. When a fighter pilot fired at a crossing target, he needed to aim not at the visible enemy aircraft, but at some point in empty space, where that target would be when the bullets finally arrived. The calculation demanded knowing the enemy's speed, heading, range, and rate of turn, variables constantly shifting during combat. Human minds simply couldn't process the mathematics quickly enough, but a gyroscope could. Cunningham's breakthrough came when he grasped that the same physical principles keeping his laboratory gyroscope stable could be harnessed to predict aircraft motion. If he mounted gyroscopes inside an aircraft's gun sight, they would detect banking and turning motions and automatically calculate where a target would be in the future. The pilot wouldn't need to solve any equations. The machine would handle the deflection problem entirely through mechanical means. The prototype Cunningham constructed looked like a mechanical brain. 2 gyroscopes, each spinning at 15,000 RPM, were mounted perpendicular to each other, inside a housing barely larger than a shoebox. One gyroscope detected left-right turning motion, while the other sensed up-down movement. Electric motors kept the gyros spinning as a complex array of gears, cams, and optical devices translated their motions into aiming corrections projected onto the pilot's windscreen. The sight functioned by overlaying 2 images, a fixed circle showing where the aircraft's guns were actually pointed, and a moving diamond pattern that shifted automatically based on the gyroscope's calculations. The pilot's task became deceptively simple: measure the target's wingspan using a dial, adjust for range, then keep the moving diamond on the target and squeeze the trigger. The gyroscopes would handle everything else. Testing commenced at the Royal Aircraft Establishment's gunnery range in late 1941. Squadron leader James Johnson, a veteran pilot with 12 confirmed kills, volunteered for the first live-fire trials. Johnson had developed his deflection shooting skills through hundreds of combat hours, learning to estimate lead angles through hard-won experience. He was skeptical that any machine could improve on human intuition. The testing aircraft, a Henry Target tug, climbed methodically to 2,000 feet, following patterns so predictable you could set a watch by them. Johnson gripped his reflector sight and opened fire. His bullets found their marks with impressive regularity. Roughly 30% of his ammunition connected with the target. By RAF standards, this was extraordinary marksmanship. Then the technicians made their adjustment. They mounted Cunningham's gyroscopic sight into Johnson's Hurricane. Everything changed on his first approach. Johnson's eyes locked onto the diamond pattern dancing across his vision. It moved with liquid precision, tracking ahead of the Henry like an invisible hand, predicting exactly where the aircraft would be. The geometry seemed almost impossibly generous, a lead that looked absurdly far from the actual target. He squeezed his trigger for 2 seconds, 6 machine guns hammered in unison, tracers streaked toward the sky, the Henry's wing erupted into fragments. He checked his ammunition consumption, 75% hit rate, 3 times better than before. Johnson landed and immediately demanded a conversation with Fighter Command. The implications were too significant to ignore. Within weeks, the Air Ministry slapped a most secret classification on Cunningham's invention. Production orders went out. American intelligence networks picked up the signals in late 1942, and the word spread through the Pentagon like electricity. Colonel Cass Huff, chief of the Army Air Force's Armament Division, understood what this meant. He flew to England to see it himself. What he encountered surpassed his boldest expectations. The RAF's gyroscopic sights were transforming ordinary pilots into precision marksmen. Squadrons equipped with these devices were destroying targets at triple the rate of units still using fixed reflector sights. Huff moved quickly. He contacted the Sperry Corporation in Brooklyn, America's premier manufacturer of precision instruments. They'd been perfecting fire control systems for naval guns since the 1920s. They were the only choice. By January 1943, Sperry's engineers had taken Cunningham's British prototype, reverse-engineered it completely, and begun manufacturing the American version. They called it the K-14 computing gun sight. What Sperry created was simultaneously more sophisticated and more refined than the original. Their refinements were elegant. The gyroscopic mechanism lost weight, 18 pounds reduced to 13, while gaining reliability. The optical system maintained crystal clarity even as aircraft twisted through violent combat maneuvers, pulling multiple Gs. American manufacturing techniques made mass production possible. Sperry's Brooklyn factory was churning out 1,000 K-14 sights every month. Each sight contained over 400 precision-machined parts. The gyroscopes inside spun at 18,000 RPM, held in jeweled bearings like those found in luxury watches. These bearings came from the same Swiss craftsmen who built timepieces. Electric motors, powered by the aircraft's generator, kept the gyros spinning continuously. A mechanical computer, intricate beyond belief, translated the gyroscope's precession into aiming corrections accurate to fractions of a degree. Yet operating the sight remained almost startlingly simple despite this internal complexity. A pilot spotted an enemy aircraft and began tracking it through gentle turns. As the fighter banked to follow the target, the K-14's gyroscopes sensed the rotation instantly and began solving the geometry of interception. The pilot twisted a dial on the sight's housing, setting the target's wingspan. 32 feet for a Mitsubishi, 40 feet for a Zero, 64 feet for a bomber. A twist grip on the throttle adjusted for estimated range. The gyroscopes handled everything else. They projected a moving diamond pattern at exactly the right point in space, where mathematics promised the target would be. This demanded a complete psychological reversal from everything pilots had learned. For decades, marksmen aimed directly at their targets. The K-14 required something that felt like madness, aiming at empty sky, trusting invisible calculations over what their eyes told them. Experienced pilots struggled against this barrier. Their instincts screamed that firing at nothing guaranteed a miss. Yet the mathematics never lied. By summer 1943, the first K-14 sights reached combat squadrons in the Pacific and Europe. They arrived wrapped in strict security classifications and accompanied by technical manuals. But there was no comprehensive training program. Squadron commanders improvised their own methods for teaching pilots this revolutionary technology. Some units adapted quickly. Others struggled against decades of conventional gunnery wisdom. Nobody knew yet whether a mechanical brain could truly solve the ancient problem of hitting fast-moving targets in three-dimensional space. Captain Chuck Yeager banked his P-51 Mustang into a climbing turn above the Romanian countryside. Eyes scanning for the Luftwaffe fighters that intelligence said would be defending the oil refineries. August 15, 1944. The 8th Air Force was launching its third major strike against Germany's most critical petroleum source. Below, black columns of smoke boiled from burning storage tanks. American bombers continued their systematic destruction of Hitler's fuel supply. Yeager was 21 years old and already a reputation among the 363rd Fighter Squadron's most aggressive pilots. 3 months earlier, he'd scored his first kill, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 over France during the D-Day fighting. That victory had required closing to 100 yards, near enough to glimpse the German pilot's face before opening fire. Today would be different. Mounted behind Yeager's head sat one of the first K-14 computing gun sights to reach the 8th Air Force, a device promising to revolutionize how pilots destroyed enemies. The sight had arrived at Liston Airfield just 2 weeks prior, accompanied by Sperry technicians who spent days calibrating the delicate gyroscopic mechanism. Yeager flew 3 training missions with it, learning to trust the moving diamond pattern over instincts honed in actual combat. The psychological adjustment proved harder than mastering the mechanics. Everything he'd absorbed about gunnery screamed to aim directly at his target. The K-14 demanded he fire at empty space where mathematics promised the target would arrive. That first test came at 14,000 feet. A lone Messerschmitt Bf 109 appeared, climbing toward the bomber stream. The German fighter wore standard gray-green camouflage and carried yellow wingtips, markings of an experienced pilot who'd survived years fighting over North Africa and the Russian front. The German crossed Yeager's flight path at 45 degrees, presenting exactly the kind of deflected shot that frustrated American pilots endlessly. With his old reflector sight, Yeager would have needed to close to 200 yards and pray for luck. The deflection angle was too severe for reliable hits at distance. The German pilot would break into evasive maneuvers the moment he spotted the pursuing Mustang. The K-14 changed everything completely. Jaeger could engage from 800 yards, well beyond the range where conventional pilots could calculate lead angles. He set his wingspan dial to 32 feet, the Bf-109's measured span. He adjusted his range using the twist grip on his throttle. The K-14's gyroscopes began their silent calculations. Two images appeared on his windscreen, a fixed circle showing where his 650 caliber machine guns pointed, and the moving diamond pattern dancing like a mechanical prophecy across the sky. The German maintained his steady climb, apparently unaware that death tracked him from below. Jaeger followed through a gentle left turn, keeping his flight path smooth to avoid confusing the gyroscopes. The diamond swung ahead of the Bf-109 by what appeared to be 60 feet, an aiming point impossibly far from the actual aircraft. At 600 yards, Jaeger pressed his trigger. 6 machine guns erupted simultaneously. 50 caliber rounds streamed through the thin air at 2,800 feet per second. Jaeger held the trigger for exactly 2 seconds. 1,952 rounds poured out in a concentrated burst following the K-14's calculated trajectory. The results were immediate and devastating. Jaeger's bullets arrived at the precise moment when the climbing Messerschmitt entered space that had been empty a split second before. Armor-piercing rounds tore through the engine block. Incendiary bullets ignited fuel lines and hydraulic systems. The Bf-109's left wing folded upward as structural supports failed. The entire aircraft began tumbling toward the Romanian countryside below. Jaeger watched the German pilot bail out, his parachute blossoming white against green farmland. 12 seconds, from initial contact to victory, half the time his previous kills had required, twice the range. More importantly, Jaeger had fired just 1,952 rounds to achieve the kill. Normally, he expended 400 to 600 rounds for each victory. The ammunition efficiency was staggering. Across the entire 8th Air Force, the pattern repeated. Squadrons equipped with K-14 sights reported ammunition consumption dropping by 60% while kill rates doubled. The 307th Fighter Group, known as the Yoxford Boys, saw their monthly totals leap from 15 to 35 after converting to gyroscopic sights. The percentage of pilots scoring kills climbed from the traditional 5% to nearly 20%. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, compiled detailed statistics through summer 1944. Pilots using the computing site averaged 2.2 kills per mission, compared to 0.8 kills for those still using reflector sights. The difference became even more dramatic in long-range engagements beyond 400 yards, where traditional sights were virtually useless. The K-14 maintained consistent accuracy. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and profound. Combat reports began mentioning uncanny accuracy from American fighters. Experienced pilots described engagements where American aircraft seemed to predict their every move. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran ace with over 100 victories, wrote in his diary, "The Americans fire at empty sky, yet every bullet finds its mark. It is as if they possess supernatural foresight." Intelligence analysis of captured German documents revealed their desperation to understand American gunnery improvements. Luftwaffe technical teams examined wreckage from shot-down P-51s and P-38s, searching for clues about mysterious accuracy increases. They discovered the K-14 sights but lacked industrial capacity to reverse engineer the complex gyroscopic mechanisms. German attempts to develop competing technology founded on material shortages and the chaos of a collapsing industrial base. By September 1944, the effectiveness gap had grown so pronounced that German fighter pilots began avoiding combat entirely when spotting American formations. The kill-to-loss ratio in the European theater reached 10-1 in favor of America, effectively neutralizing the Luftwaffe as a strategic force. Fighter Command credited 60% of the improvement to better training and tactics. Frontline squadron commanders knew better. The K-14 computing sight had transformed average pilots into deadly marksmen. The revolution extended beyond individual pilot performance. Squadron-level tactics evolved to exploit the K-14's long-range accuracy. American fighters engaged enemy formations from distances previously considered ineffective. The traditional dogfight, aircraft maneuvering at close range until one pilot gained advantage, became increasingly rare as American pilots learned to destroy opponents before closing to visual range. Yet even as the K-14 reached peak effectiveness, reports from the Pacific hinted at new challenges. Japanese pilots described American aircraft with impossible speed and maneuverability, suggesting jet technology might soon make even this revolutionary sight obsolete. Major Dick Bong adjusted his parachute straps and settled into his P-38 Lightning's cockpit at Tacloban airstrip on Leyte. A group of replacement pilots gathered around his aircraft for what had become a weekly ritual. December 17, 1944. Bong had just returned from dawn patrol with his confirmed kill total standing at 39, one short of the magic 40 that would secure his place in aviation history. The young pilots, fresh from stateside training schools, stared at America's leading ace with mixture of awe and desperate hope that some of his lethal skill might transfer to them. The morning briefing identified scattered Japanese air activity over Mindoro, where American amphibious forces were establishing another foothold in the Philippines. Intelligence suggested the enemy might attempt one final air offensive to disrupt the landings, throwing remaining experienced pilots and precious fuel reserves into a desperate gambit. Bong would lead a sweep of 4 P-38s, hunting for any Japanese aircraft bold enough to challenge American air superiority. Lieutenant Tommy Morrison, a 20-year-old from Kansas with 0 combat victories, raised his hand nervously. "Major Bong, sir, could you show us how the K-14 sight really works? I mean, in actual combat." Morrison had been in theater 6 weeks and fired his guns in anger exactly twice, both times missing Japanese fighters by margins that seemed impossible despite his perfect sight picture. Bong smiled and gestured toward his Lightning's nose, where the K-14 computing gun sight was mounted behind armored glass. The device represented the pinnacle of wartime technology. 13 pounds of precision gyroscopes, electric motors, and optical systems solving deflection equations 60 times per second, even as the aircraft pulled 4 Gs in violent combat maneuvers. "The sight doesn't make you a better pilot," Bong explained patiently. "It just makes the mathematics impossible to screw up." He pointed toward a flight of Navy F-6F Hellcats practicing gunnery runs against a target sleeve 3 miles offshore. "Watch those Hellcats." You could see it plainly in how they operated. Those Japanese pilots needed to get within roughly 200 yards before their guns started finding their mark with any real consistency. "That's the problem when you're working with fixed sights," Bong explained. "You're aiming at where the target actually is, not where it's heading." His words carried the weight of a man who had flown through 200 combat missions in some of the deadliest skies the world had ever known. The chance to prove his point came faster than anyone anticipated. Flying at 11,000 feet above Mindoro, Bong's formation spotted a lone Japanese Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighter. The enemy pilot was on a reconnaissance run, trying to photograph the American beach positions below. He was good, that much was clear, threading between clouds while staying high enough to bolt if American fighters appeared. Most pilots would have needed to work their way into position, edging closer until they could squeeze off shots at virtually point-blank range. Bong saw a different path forward. He reached over and set his K-14 gyroscopic sight's wingspan dial to match the Tony's 32-foot measurement. Now the sight knew exactly what it was looking for. At 600 yards distance, the mechanical brain of the K-14 locked onto the Japanese fighter and its gyroscopes sprang to life. A moving diamond pattern materialized in Bong's windscreen, automatically calculating where the Tony would be in the next fraction of a second. To the young pilots flying behind him, it appeared as though Bong was aiming at nothing but open sky. Then the Tony's pilot saw the danger and reacted with desperation, yanking his fighter into a brutal climb and banking hard to the right. Under normal circumstances, this maneuver would have killed any conventional shot. The attacking fighters would have lost their angle and needed to circle around for another approach. But the K-14's gyroscopes were already recalculating, adapting in real time to the enemy's sharp turn rate. The diamond pattern shifted smoothly ahead of the climbing Tony, now leading it by what looked like 80 feet. Bong squeezed the trigger, holding it down for 3 seconds as his plane unleashed thunder. 60 rounds from the 20mm cannons and 450 rounds from the 50 caliber machine guns poured out of his P-38 into the tropical air, each projectile following its own precise trajectory toward a convergence point that the K-14 had calculated with mathematical certainty. The heavy cannon rounds punched through the Tony's wing route, while the armor-piercing bullets tore into the engine block and fuel tanks. The Japanese fighter came apart in a brilliant orange explosion that sent chunks of burning wreckage tumbling through the sky toward the jungle far below. The pilot never got the chance to jump. Bong keyed his radio as he banked away from the debris field. "Gentlemen, you just witnessed kill number 40. Notice I didn't pursue him through any wild maneuvers, didn't waste ammunition chasing a turning fight. The K-14 did all the real work. I simply kept those diamonds on target and pulled the trigger." His voice stayed steady and measured, but those young pilots flying behind him could sense the satisfaction in those words, the sound of a man executing his craft with absolute precision. That 40th kill meant something far bigger than just another victory for one pilot. Bong had become the first American fighter pilot to reach that number, surpassing the records of even the most celebrated German and Japanese aces from the early war years. More significantly, his achievement proved something revolutionary about the K-14 itself. It showed that the art of aerial combat could become science. Bong carried natural hunting instincts honed since childhood on his family's Wisconsin farm, where he had learned to read animals and predict movement. The K-14 took those instincts and multiplied them, making his deadly skills something that ordinary pilots could learn and replicate. The numbers told the story. Squadrons using K-14 sights were posting kill ratios that shattered every pre-war prediction. The 475th Fighter Group flying P-38s over the Philippines was achieving 20 confirmed kills for every loss. Over in Europe, the 307th Fighter Group was matching those numbers against the Luftwaffe. Pilots who had struggled for months to score their first kill were becoming aces in a matter of weeks once they got their hands on the computing sight. Even Captain Bob Johnson, the second leading ace in the European theatre with 27 confirmed victories, had initially rejected the K-14 as unnecessary complexity. Johnson had spent hundreds of combat hours developing his deflection shooting the hard way, learning through instinct and brutal experience how to calculate lead angles in his head. The idea of trusting a machine to replace his own judgment felt fundamentally wrong to a pilot who had stayed alive by trusting his gut. Then he flew one mission with the K-14. 3 confirmed kills in a single sortie over Berlin changed his mind completely. "The thing's got better eyes than I do," he told his squadron mates afterwards. "I can see what the target is doing, but this machine knows what it's going to do next." That conversion happened across both theaters again and again. Skeptical veterans flew one mission with the computing sight and became its most passionate advocates. The psychological impact on the enemy was equally profound. Japanese pilots started talking about American fighters with an almost supernatural accuracy, describing engagements where it seemed like the enemy could anticipate their every evasive move. Intercepted radio traffic showed Japanese pilots increasingly reluctant to engage American formations, even when they had numerical superiority. By late 1944, the combination of K-14 sights and better training had essentially ended Japanese air resistance throughout the Philippines. Enemy fighters barely appeared over American positions anymore. When they did, the fights were over in seconds, completely one-sided. The Imperial Navy's veteran pilots, men who had flown at Pearl Harbor and in those early Pacific battles, found themselves powerless against American fighters that could shoot accurately from what they thought were safe distances. Just as the K-14 reached its perfect effectiveness, troubling reports started coming back from Europe. German jet fighters were appearing in growing numbers, aircraft so fast that even the computing sight struggled to calculate proper lead angles. The age of the gyroscopic gun sight was ending, just as it had finally achieved flawless performance. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Major Dick Bong walked across the concrete ramp at Lockheed's Burbank facility, his flight boots clicking against pavement still wet from California rain the night before. Sitting before him was the P-80 Shooting Star, and it represented everything the propeller-driven fighters of the war were not. No spinning blades, no roaring radial engine, no familiar shake of reciprocating pistons. Just the sleek promise of jet power that could push a fighter beyond 500 miles per hour. At 25, Bong had become far more than just America's leading ace with 40 confirmed victories. He stood as the living symbol of aerial combat's golden age, a farm boy from Wisconsin who had transformed hunting skills and revolutionary technology into something approaching mechanical perfection. The K-14 computing site had amplified his natural talents, and now the war that had created both man and machine was nearly finished. Germany had surrendered months earlier, and Japan's remaining air force existed mostly on paper. Lockheed had offered Bong a chance to lead their test pilot program for the new jet fighters. They understood that his combat experience was precious as they guided American aviation from the propeller age into the jet age. The P-80 was America's answer to the German Me-262, a sleek machine designed to make everything before it look as outdated as fabric-covered biplanes. But unlike the fighters Bong had mastered, the Shooting Star carried no gyroscopic gun sight. The speed made deflection shooting even more complicated, yet the solutions to those problems remained locked in the old generation of technology. Bong lowered himself into the P-80's cockpit, struck immediately by the absence of engine vibration as the Allison J-33 turbojet came to life. The flight controls felt responsive despite the aircraft's radical design, and the bubble canopy offered visibility that dwarfed anything he had experienced in his P-38 Lightning. Yet something about the experience felt fundamentally wrong. Without the K-14's diamond patterns dancing across his windscreen, that mechanical intelligence that had made him the deadliest pilot in American history, the aircraft felt incomplete. The takeoff roll was deceptively smooth. Unlike the thunderous acceleration of piston engines, the P-80 built up speed with subtle efficiency, lifting off after just 800 feet of concrete. Bong retracted the landing gear and felt the Shooting Star's clean design carry him upward in a climb rate no propeller aircraft could match. At 10,000 feet, he leveled out and explored the jet's handling, marveling at how the controls stayed responsive even as he pushed the speed toward 450 miles per hour. But that revolutionary performance came with equally revolutionary dangers. The fuel system was far more intricate than anything Bong had flown, demanding careful management of pumps and tanks to keep the engine running. A piston fighter could glide considerable distances with a dead engine. The Shooting Star became simply a streamlined rock without jet power. Ejection seats were still experimental. Most test pilots who had used them weren't coming home. At precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, the P-80's main fuel pump failed without warning. Bong felt the engine sputter, hesitate, then lose power as fuel pressure dropped below critical levels. He had perhaps 30 seconds of engine time remaining, just enough to attempt a dead stick landing back at Burbank if he reacted instantly and flew perfectly. The other choice was ejecting from an experimental seat that had killed more pilots than it had saved. Bong decided to stay with the aircraft. He pushed the nose down to maintain flying speed and began a shallow gliding turn back toward the runway. The P-80's clean lines gave it good glide characteristics, but the math was brutal. He was 3 miles from the field, at 5,000 feet altitude, descending at 800 feet per minute. The numbers were close, possibly achievable, but only if he flew a perfect approach with zero margin for error. The Shooting Star descended through 4,000 feet as Bong aligned with Burbank's main runway. His airspeed held steady at 180 miles per hour, fast for a gliding approach but necessary to maintain control. At 2,000 feet, he lowered the landing gear manually and immediately felt the aircraft's glide angle steepen as the wheels created extra drag. The runway seemed within reach, barely. At 500 feet above the ground, the truth became clear. He was going to come up short. The P-80's glide path would take him down into a residential neighborhood 3 blocks beyond the airport boundary. He had perhaps 10 seconds to choose between trying to stretch his glide, risking a stall, or ejecting from a seat that had never been tested at such low altitude. Neither option offered much promise. Bong pulled the ejection handles. The experimental seat threw him upward with tremendous force, but the altitude was too low. His parachute never deployed fully. He struck the ground moments before the P-80 crashed into a residential street, killing America's greatest fighter pilot in a fireball that consumed both man and machine. 8,000 miles away that same day, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. The weight of Bong's death echoed through American aviation. The pilot who had perfected the marriage of human skill and mechanical precision had died in an aircraft representing the future, a future where raw speed mattered more than the deflection shooting skills that had made him legendary. The K-14 computing site, revolutionary technology that had transformed aerial warfare, was already becoming obsolete as jet aircraft created new problems that mechanical brains couldn't solve. Within weeks of Bong's death, Japan surrendered completely. The war that had driven the K-14's development ended with weapons so terrible that air-to-air combat seemed almost quaint. Nuclear bombs, carried by high-altitude bombers, promised to make fighter aircraft irrelevant. Jet technology created tactical challenges that existing solutions couldn't address. Colonel Cass Hoof, the Army Air Force officer who had first recognized the K-14's potential, prepared a final report on the site's effectiveness in September 1945. The results were stunning. Pilots using computing sites scored 2.2 times more kills per mission than those using fixed reflector sites. Ace production had jumped by 400%. More than anything else, the K-14 had democratized killing. It took average pilots and transformed them into deadly marksmen through mechanical precision combined with human skill. Yet the technology's deepest lesson went beyond gunnery itself. The K-14 taught an entire generation of American pilots to think in 3 dimensions, to solve physics problems while experiencing multiple G-forces in violent combat. These cognitive abilities would prove invaluable in the decades ahead as aviation moved towards supersonic speeds, space exploration, and missile warfare. Test pilots, airline captains, and NASA astronauts would carry forward the K-14's fundamental insight. Real success often meant aiming not at where things were, but at where they would be. The final irony appeared months after the fighting ended. American occupation forces discovered German blueprints for an advanced gyroscopic gun sight that would have surpassed the K-14. Designed by Zeke engineers in January 1945, this device would have incorporated radar ranging and electronic computation that could have transformed Luftwaffe gunnery. But the blueprints were dated just weeks before Germany's collapse, far too late to change anything. The Americans had won the technological race by mere months, proving that in war, as in physics, timing determines everything.